Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel simply is called Discerning What is True. I'm going to be reading from a particular book today, simply called Psychology and Kabbalah. The chapter is going to be dealing with what I call number 44. And the title of the chapter is simply called Interactions. So thank you for being here. So let's get into the reading. We have now built up a development and structural picture of the psyche and seen how it relates to the scheme of the Yuzaratic tree. We have become aware of how all the general elements fit into a working organism that gradually matures from infancy into adult, whose inherited tendencies interact with the environment. These interactions were defined both by Freud and Carl Jung, according to the science of their time. The terms used in defining and analyzing the structures and dynamics of the physical world were applied to the psyche. This is the esoteric, that is, quote unquote, as above, so below, end quote. So when there are people out here that make these comments, is as above, so below, they don't understand what they're talking about. Okay, this is work. Okay, this is not something just happenstance. Okay, and there are many who just simply say the jargon because that's all they hear from other broadcasters in YouTube or wherever they read it at, and they just make the statement, but they don't understand in reality. Nothing's happened to them, you see, because they haven't done any kind of work at all. They have not dig, they haven't pursued things, they haven't even tried to study. They just make a comment. It's very juvenile. So the technique used in reverse in order to perceive the same laws at work within a different reality. Jung saw the psyche as a relatively contained system which converted external inputs like sensor impressions and food into psychic energy. Such intakes, he thought, continually disturbed the equilibrium of the psyche, so that it was always in movement. Seen Kabbalistically, the stimulus coming up in the body is transformed from a coarse into a finer order, which can then enter the psyche through the lower face of the Yuzara organism. An example of this is a good meal and conversation. Both generate nourishment as the psyche, like the body, extracts what is needed to sustain it. Carl Jung went on to observe that the psyche would never attain a perfect balance because of all this activity. However, it did seek a working stability as each side of the psychological tree came into prominence. It was countered by the sephirah and triads of the other pillar. So the whole idea of the two pillars is to eventually bring you into balance within, that is, within the middle pillar. He also speculated that the psyche was deprived of external stimuli. It must eventually become becalmed like a stagnant pool. This occurs in total madness when a completely isolated psyche is turned into a mental cesspool because there is nothing fresh flowing into it. The normal psyche, it appeared, is in a state of continuous change with internal and external pressures shifting between the poles of quiescency and crisis. The latter were necessary for the psyche to remain interested and alert and not sink into the indolent inefficiencies. This is why people seek out excitement and even danger. However, it was noted that the average person did not go to such extremes, but kept their tree gently swaying and alive. Jung used the term libido to define this process, but he expanded this image to mean, expanded its range to mean not only the id, the flesh, needs, but also to include the drives that all people have to achieve what is important to them, be it a pursuit of a worldly satisfaction or something of a higher order. Thus, The energy of the psyche could circulate in the lower phases of the tree as thoughts, feelings, and actions to be used in maintaining the side triads or help in transforming experience into the personal and collective unconscious. This energy was the fuel of the dreaming process and the driving force of inner of inner growth. Carl Jung also saw a reciprocal action between body and psyche, and that they would stimulate, I'm sorry, that they could stimulate or stultify as well as feed and prompt each other. This exchange is the process that passes through the Yasad-Da combination of the ego, which acts as a two-way transformer. Psychosomatic events are based upon the direct reciprocation as well as upon the principle of resonance transmitted by the side pillars. An example of this is the man, example of this is the man who literally gets scared stiff before a parachute jump. Figure 46 says pressures. Here, the emotional triad of constraint, fear, and all the memories associated with pain and control exerts a direct influence on the surrounding functions and triads. If this or any triad is overloaded or unrestrained, it can cripple the psyche, for example. A life dominated by paranoia or nymphomania, mania, even the triads of the spirit is not balanced, can generate a holy madness in which the person has no contact with reality, earthly reality. A so-called normal psyche means that the mind is more or less coordinated and can operate well within its interior and exterior limits. Another innovation, I should say, introduced by Carl Jung about the general operations of the psyche was the idea of psyche values. According to this concept, a person distributes what psyche energy he or she has in the various ways, depending upon what the individual considers most important. Thus, a woman interested in sport will devote much time and energy to that occupation, while a man who writes poetry will allocate an enormous amount of his libido into that area. This means that the loading of the psychological tree will be different for each individual. Out of this, a hierarchy of interests that is, will emerge as the person selects their priorities. And one person's security may predominate over everything, while another freedom might be their chief preoccupation. These values, Carl Jung observed, were not absolutely but relative, so that while an artist might love painting, his family would nevertheless take precedence, I should say, because he considered them more important. It is also noted that those who invest their energy in many things cannot focus enough attention upon any single subject in depth, and so fail to become a master of their field. Leonardo da Vinci was an exception, but even he had his limitations, for he left many unfinished projects. Here we see how the emphasis of values can affect the balance of a tree. Take, for instance, the poor Scots boy who went to America, made a fortune, and then returned home to live like a liar. He spent all of his energy and substance to compensate for a lack of ego esteem. However, within himself, he still felt, and acted as a poor boy because he set such a high value on frugality. Jung saw psyche values as the basics of the various complexes, thus association of interest clustered together in important constellations. Less focused topics only had a tenuous relationship because the charge with which they were infused was not strong enough to assert any force, or because they were checked by an equally strong anti-catharacts concept or emotion, such as the desire for but fear of pregnancy. The cluster of high value elements were, for example, easily observed in the person who loved writing or doing business, pursuing pleasure or study, and they were equally apparent in the things some people avoided, like work or responsibility. Not so clear were these complexes that were of high value, but not manifested which nevertheless influenced the person from their unconscious in quote odd end quote attitudes. neurosis, and psychosis. These might be a hidden fantasy or obsession that could only be observed in dreams because they were so heavily disguised by a quote reaction formation end quote. Such an excessive common sense of reasonableness. Here is the unconscious counterbalance to an unconscious drive in the psyche, as energy seeks to find a working solution within the fabric of the tree. Another example of this is the person who is exceptionally fictitious. Such people often have chaotic psyches that are suppressed by the ego because the person cannot admit to their true state of mind. The energy used to hold back what is seen as grave, grave, interior threat builds up a highly organized external world in order to preserve the image of a complete control. This often leads to what is known as neurasthenia or chronic fatigue, which only allows the person to function at a lower standard of performance. However, this condition does not solve the basic problem. Many people live in such states of compensated imbalances for much of their lives. As will be seen, a great many things can occur within the apparent simplicity of the tree, as layer upon layer of associations and constellations activate this or that complex or concept. These emphases will both enhance and oppose others, causing some to take up enormous quantities of energy while others will be depleted. In the case of extremes, like any malfunction of the body, the psyche system can sicken into various forms of pathology. Observations, deductions, and intuitiveness led Jung to a concept that is called complex indicators, end quote. This might be a person's outspokenness or reticence on certain subjects. Such things cause him to believe that the quote law of equivalent, end quote, were at work. For instance, when a boy reaches adolescence, he switches his focus from games to sex. Thus, all the id nefesh passions he put into football will go into the strategy of outwitting rivals and getting the girl. This redirecting of the libido and mortido impulses is a sign of equilibrium, or say equilibrance, as one set of values loses its power to another set as it absorbs and uses it, encountering that quantity, what I call a quantum of energy now available. Such events happen all the time as the psyche shifts in the process of growth and transformation. This discovery was extremely significant because it explained how the psyche adjusted to what we call different situations by borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. Jung also saw equivalence at work in the relationship between the conscious and unconscious as psychological energy was bound into Yuzera form and then passed into the unconscious to lie dormant or only surfacely active, except for the occasional flicker across the USADA screen of the ego or outbursts of cathartic release, such as anger or love. It was also noted that when the persona took more than its quota of energy, the ego was often disbiligated. For instance, there are professional sergeant majors who are quite docile at home when they are out of uniform. This was equally true of the young woman with a dominant eminent or a left pillar in her psyche who cultivated a excessive femininity, I should say, to attract a strong male who would supply a protective substitute for a feeble right pillar. A second and complementary principle is entropia, I should say, which determines the way the energy pattern flows. In this, the greater tendency to drain its energy into the lesser, even as hot water loses its heat into cold water in the search for equilibrium. Within the systems of psyche, many such exchanges occur as various elements discharge their tensions into ease, as when an intense feeling is put into a poem or a letter. This process of entropy is vital of the tree wood, indeed, entropia. For instance, opposing values breed conflicts that need solutions which move the person on. Weaknesses in one complex can generate a strength in another, like the fear of failure that drives a man to work harder. likewise an archetype prominent for a period, but that is has to give away under the law of entropia to the one that takes its place, or it is opposite. Example is the beaten bully who becomes totally submissive in defeat as the emphasis is reversed and power flows into the hands of the non-victorious ex-victim, I should say. In the young or undeveloped, these exchanges are simple and sometimes dramatic because the energy is not diffused like it is in the well-developed psyche of a mature tree. An adult mind is more complicated by checks and balances, but these give it stability. Such structures built up by experience can hold or soften a surge of pleasure or pain, even as fine sand absorbs a blast of an explosion. The resolution between opposing flows, like wishing to have the privilege of adulthood but not its responsibility, is one of the processes of maturation that's being mature as the psychological tree fills out and differentials into more subtle vehicle for the individual to use. Entropia directs the incoming energy to where it is needed, while equivalent maintains its potential as energy. Potence, I should say, potence as energy is used up or is locked into new forms within the psyche. Here we see the interaction of active and passive sides of the tree as several paths and triads operate in pairs up and down and from side to side. An example of these complex operations is the Gerano. Can complementary, or I should say complement anything in the tree that is directly related to it. Temporal can act as a partner, as can banal or Hod or Hesed, which means that each principle can have many combinations. This process is vital when one is working through a problem in several angles and levels. This triad, I'm sorry, not this triad, the triads are also subject to the law of entropia, as are the upper and lower faces, the self and the ego in the body. So too are the conscious and unconscious and the dimensions of soul and spirit. All these and many other possible combinations reveal the wide variety of movement within the psychological tree. However, all of this involves another major process that Jung spoke of, synthesis. That will be the conclusion of chapter 44 tonight. So thank you for being here. So that's my conclusion tonight. We will do another chapter the next day or two. It's probably over 3/4 of done with this particular book. It's almost finished. It's amazing the information that's being provided here. Um, again, the title of the book is simply called Psychology and Kabbalah. And me and Phil talked a little bit about that our meeting on Thursday. So we'll probably talk a little bit more about that. We hopefully can meet next Thursday. But I don't know if that's going to work out. It will work out for me. That is, it's Thanksgiving, so it's not a big deal because I'm single and I don't really celebrate Thanksgiving. That is, I don't cook and all that stuff. So I mean, I cook. But I mean, what I mean is that it would be good just simply meet with Phil. So hopefully that'll work out with Phil. I don't know his situation at all, so we'll see how that works out. But there'll be some questions that we didn't finish up with the whole deal of the tarot cards, the Greek, what we call the Greek language, which has 22 letters, also the 22 ways within the tarot cards, and also I should say that not only that, but the Kabbalah, and also the 22 chapters in Revelation. All this is added together. That these people knew this stuff long ago. Unfortunately, they've always been a minority. And but anyway, thank you for being here, and you have a good evening tonight. You take care.